Good day, friends. I am often asked, why do you have videos only about women? So, since we are talking about India, I would like to quote the words of the famous Indian politician Jawaharlal Nehru, who said, "To answer the question of how things are with this or that people, I just need to know what the status of women is there." So, to understand what it was like to live in India in ancient times, let's talk about the life of women. Well, let's start with the legend. Once upon a time there was a king whose name was Bangaswana, who was famous for his wisdom and piety. So, he was lucky to live both as a man and as a woman. According to legend, when the gods asked him in what form he would like to spend the remaining years, Bangaswana, without hesitation, said that he chooses to remain a woman. According to the Vedam, a woman gets pleasure from food twice as much as a man. A woman is 4 times more astute and 6 times more courageous than a man and enjoys sex 8 times more than her partner. It would seem, what is the relationship to a woman? But at the same time, it was believed that the fact that you were born with a woman was a punishment for your sins in a previous life. A man is always God to you, and your parents will not be happy about your birth at all and will try to marry you off at a very young age. But unless, of course, they give the temple dancer to Devadesa. Was a woman obliged to wash her husband's feet every night and had no right to reproach even the most disgusting husband with anything? How will love in ancient Greek so amaze Europeans? Was there polyandry in India? How did one woman have 12 husbands? Why did women of easy virtue wear only red? And what was it like to live in the Maharaja's harem? Meet our heroine, Vijaya. Her relatives met her birth not with joy, but with despondency. In ancient times, in India, the birth of a girl was considered a punishment to parents for sins. The girl's mother was bullied, well, because this lab is for life. The elder sister Vijay, conceived on an unfavorable day, was given to the temple by her parents, and she will be Devadesa. Well, Vijay was married when she was very young. If in ancient times girls were married at the age of 12, then in the Middle Ages they were married at 6 or 8. So our Vijay's husband was not even old enough to be a father, but a grandfather. Now her life was completely devoted to her husband and caring for him. She is obliged to treat him with respect and be something like a servant or even a slave. But in general, her husband was kind to her and treated her like a granddaughter, because she grew up in his house with her grandchildren from her first wife. Vijay thought she was lucky, because her older sister, who became a temple dancer, Devadasi, had to love not one man, but many. But then a terrible thing happened. Vijay's husband had died, and now she had to die with him or become a widow. And this at the age of 16. Women in ancient India in every sense of the word depended on the health of her husband. One of the most frightening rituals. Sati. According to him, a woman whose husband died should be burned at the stake with him. It was believed that by the death of her husband, the gods punish a woman for her sins, and it is she who is to blame for his death. My husband is dying at the woman who in a previous life beat off other people's husbands. Well, if the spouse is burned together with him, it will cleanse him and all his relatives from earthly sins, and they will both be happy to live in heaven for another 35 million years. Imagine what a horror. It happened that women did not ask for consent to this. Only a wife who had committed sati was considered an immaculate woman with a clean reputation. And the word sati itself actually meant a kind, good woman, that is, a devoted wife who chose for herself the path of becoming a goddess or sati maga, overcoming death. Even queens or, say, wives of soldiers who lost a battle resorted to the terrible rite of sati. It's scary to even imagine how many women have been victims of this cruel rite throughout history. Although it is believed that it was committed by no more than 2% of widows, and that belonged mainly to the highest aristocratic caste. Nevertheless, there are still hundreds of temples dedicated to the victims of sati in India. But if the wife died, then the man not only did not have to burn himself alive with her, but had the right to marry again. The most frightening thing is that the last case of sati occurred quite recently, in 1987. And just 36 years ago, more than half of the people living near the tragedy said that it was her own choice, and only a few said that simply otherwise her life would have turned into a real hell. By the way, you will be shocked, but there was such a ceremony in Russia. An Arab traveler of the 10th century describes the funeral of a noble Rus, which he himself visited. So, according to him, the one of the wives of Rus, who loved her master the most, had to follow him to the funeral pyre. However, scientists are still arguing whether these Rus were Vikings. In any case, fortunately, this terrible tradition did not take root for a long time. This is about the fact that women committed sati voluntarily. They do not take into account the alternative. What was waiting for a woman who did not dare to do this? How is our heroine, Vijaya? Since then, the rest of her life has been a nightmare. A woman who did not remember sati was considered a sinner and a disgrace to the family. Now she was practically buried alive. Can this be called a voluntary choice? She had no right to get married again. For the rest of her life, a very young Vijaya had to walk with a shaved head, where only a white mourning sari, jewelry, and makeup were forbidden to her. It is strictly forbidden to attend holidays. The appearance of a widow on Peru was considered a bad omen, and, of course, it was impossible to communicate with men. Any amenities were also prohibited. Widowed Vijaya now slept on the ground, ate only once a day. At the same time, she was not allowed to eat honey and meat, drink wine and use salt. From now on, until the end of her days, she had to fast and pray to ensure her remarriage with her husband in the next incarnation, and her presence was perceived by others as a curse. It was only in 1856 that the British government legally allowed a widow to marry a second time, but the widows themselves did not dare to do this for a very, very long time. Society was not ready for this. To avoid a bonfire or the fate of a widow, the women of ancient India nurtured and cherished their husbands. Every 5 years, the wife performed the rite of keeping her husband. If he fell ill, his wife fasted so that he would recover as soon as possible. The wife never called her master by name, as this could also shorten his life. Only you and you can never look him in the face. The Indian wife ate only after her husband had eaten, and she always washed his feet in the evenings. Oh, yes, you can't walk next to him yet, you need to mince a little behind, out of respect. The most authoritative treatise of the Law of Manu, compiled in the 2nd century BC, stated that a faithful wife should constantly honor her husband as God, even if he has neither virtues nor just good qualities. A wife has no right even to reproach her husband when, quoting, he succumbs to vicious passions, gets drunk or falls ill with a bad disease. But if the husband or his relatives are dissatisfied with his wife, then they had the right to just beat the woman or, say, play her or sell her. By the way, according to the law of Dharma Shastra, a young wife belonged not only to her husband, but also to his entire family. But what about love? The peculiarities of love in the ancient Indian manner are difficult for Europeans to understand. In the same 19th century, a Russian aristocrat, married by her parents, could fall in love or not fall in love with her husband. Well, that is, to decide for yourself whether to give him your heart or not. Indian women had no options to fall in love or not to fall in love with the spouse their parents married. For an ancient Indian wife, her husband is definitely a god, whom she simply has to adore with all her heart, without options. A woman does not have the right to make decisions or act at her own discretion. The Brahmanic religion does not consider a man and a woman to be equal in human dignity. Women in ancient India were equated to people from the lowest castes, to scars, to domestic animals, slaves, even whose offspring belonged only to their master. The situation of women was, of course, very difficult. They were completely subordinate first to their father, then to their husband, after the death of their uncle husband. And there is no freedom and independence there. For treason, his wife was subjected to terrible punishments, up to the death penalty. But a man had the right to have several wives at once, and this was not considered a sin at all. It would seem that darkness and horror, but contrary to European stereotypes, the submissive and uncomplaining, eternally humiliated Indian woman turns out to be nothing more than a myth, because as the mother of the family she already possessed enormous, almost absolute power. For the sake of her son, the eternally humiliated wife occupied a place of honor. As a mother, a woman was identified with the cosmic feminine in the mind and occupied the highest position of the divine hierarchy. The laws of Manu already mentioned in this regard state, the father is 100 times higher than the spiritual teacher, but the mother is 1,000 times higher than the father as the educator of the child's soul. But India would not be India if it were so simple with marriages here. There are 8 types of marriage in India. 8. In the laws of Manu, one can also find traces of polyandry, when one woman marries all the brothers at once, like the daughter of King Draupadi, who, according to the Mahabharata, married 5 Pandava brothers, that is, became their common wife, and the children born to her were considered the children of all the brothers at the same time. 1,000 years later, Ivasayana writes about polyandry in the famous Kama Sutra. This is the 3rd or 5th century of the new era. In the field of hormones, in Shiraji and Baliki, many young men are on equal rights in the women's quarters, being married to the same one, and women enjoy them either one by one or at once, according to their nature and circumstances. By the way, Badayana describes the last option in sufficient detail, which we cannot cite. By the arrival of the British, polyandry in India was preserved only in the Himalayas and in places in southern India. It was in the south of India, high in the Blue Mountains, in 1812, that the British discovered the mysterious Todas. They were lighter skinned than other Indians, with delicate facial features, and their clothes resembled Roman tunics. They themselves said that they came from the stars, and their neighbors considered them great sorcerers. But even more Britons were struck by their family customs. As a rule, the girl chose her husband. If she was already pregnant, no matter from whom, it was considered indecent to refuse her at all. In 1821, the British cartographer Ward writes that the bride, I quote, is obliged, if the husband has brothers, to recognize them as husbands and perform marital duties in front of them. But in addition to husbands, a married Toda woman, according to custom, can also have a lover, a kumful. According to the same Briton, I quote, Kumful has a separate power over her. If a young woman is in the house of one of the husbands and Kumful comes, the husband immediately orients himself and leaves her with her lover. Her lawful husband support her, and the Kumful supply her annually with clothes, tobacco and other small gifts. No less interesting was the situation with matriarchal polyandry among the Nairs of the Malabar coast of southern India. Here, the main thing in the family was the eldest mother, who led her family unit, consisting of her children, brothers, sisters and sisters' children. The household was shared, it was managed by the mother's older brother, but he himself had no property. Everything he acquired passed not to his children, but to the sons and daughters of his sisters. The cell of the society was called Tarat. Only the children of women were considered members of the Trivada. The men's children belonged to the wives' Teravads and bore their mother's surnames. Husbands had no right even to sons, those were raised by their maternal uncle. The husband of a Nair woman could only be a Nair, from another Theravada, or a Brahmin. The marital relationship was very peculiar. The husband only spent the night with his wife from time to time, and he had the right to come only at night and left at dawn, and also gave her gifts several times a year. Nothing else connected them. A woman could, if she wanted, at any time terminate a relationship with him, choose another, or even have from 8 to 12 husbands. At the same time, the Nairs are Kshatriyas, a very militant people. Here is such a mysterious India. Well, what was waiting for those who did not get married in India of the past centuries? They had several options. To become a slave of God is how Devadasi is translated, a temple priestess, a dancer, or a courtesan. A courtesan in the Indian manner is not just a lady of easy virtue. It is a real art that has its roots in the ancient tradition of Gorvatha, which means the bride of the city. There is also a sacred basis here. The Gorvatha were considered incarnate goddesses, and for any woman to become a Gorvatha was the highest honor. If ordinary people enjoyed their divine singing or dancing, then only kings or the highest nobility could afford to spend the night with them. Already at the beginning of our era in India there were a large number of terms for the designation of corrupt love or prostitution, more than 300. This indicates both the popularity and, so to speak, the wide range of services of the homeland of the Kama Sutra. In Vedic times, girls of easy virtue in India wore exclusively red clothes, and even gold jewelry was specially painted in red so that it would scare away demons from libertines. At the very bottom of society were the poorest prostitutes, Kambadasi. They were slaves, girls of the poorest families. There were widows among them who did not commit sati. Street prostitutes who ran after men and offered their services were allowed to be called. Also cheap street eyelids lured clothes and jewelry. The more expensive courtesans were called Ganika. Unlike married women, the Ganiks had incomparably more freedom. Like the Hetairai in ancient Greece, they could read, write, of course, sing and dance. In the most ancient treatise on love, the Kama Sutra says that Ganika must possess 64 types of art. These include singing, dancing, storytelling, decorating, and even architecture. The Ganiks had the right to wear gold jewelry and beautiful outfits, own property, own land and slaves. At the same time, under the threat of a whip, they had no right to refuse to please anyone their master pointed out to them. I must say that in ancient India, sex was caste. A prostitute was forbidden to serve clients from lower castes in relation to herself, but girls from higher castes were categorically forbidden to sell their bodies. The punishment for this was death. One option, a woman could end up in the harem of the ruler of ancient India. They had a lot of wives, and even concubines, who were called little wives. So, King Tamba, who lived in the 6th century BC, even set a record. He had the largest harem in the history of mankind, 16,000 concubines. But this, apparently, was not enough for them, since in addition to concubines, they also had a lot of courtesans, Ganik, who even had his own hierarchy in the harem. At the top of it were those who served the ruler Maharaja himself, the courtesans who served his wife and daughters, and there were some were of lower status. While at the very bottom of the harem hierarchy there were Ganiks whose tasks were to please not too distinguished guests and servants. Well, unlike the European Christian culture, sex in India has nothing to do with sin at all. The main thing that Indian girls are taught is to curb feelings. Yes, according to Hinduism, sex is a mystical experience through which one can achieve enlightenment. This is both art and science, which has a sacred character. No wonder the Peach Branch says, sex for the satisfaction of sexual desire is also different from the pleasure of love, just as a poor man's breakfast is different from a Maharaja's meal. The Indians have created many practices aimed at obtaining pleasure and unity through it with the divine. At the same time, any manifestations of tenderness and sympathy were categorically prohibited there. No coquetry, no challenging looks, and even more so no kissing and public hugs. By the way, even spouses can still be sentenced to imprisonment for up to 3 months for this. Even in Bollywood, kissing has been officially allowed only since 2000. Curbing one's own feelings is the main task of a woman and a sign of good upbringing. Inability to restrain irritation, anger is one of the most important thresholds. A woman in ancient India was supposed to be soft, pleasant in communication speech. That's the story.